Hello everyone and welcome back to the Mustang 310 series. We got a little bit of work to do on the old girl today. Got a tilt cylinder, a lift cylinder that's leaking. So we're just gonna pull the cylinder off, put a seal kit in it, and hopefully that'll fix it up. I got a tilt cylinder that's leaking really bad too, but that's kind of my fault. The last time I took it apart, I had to use an air hammer on the nut at the end of the cylinder, and I dinged up the rod, and we probably need to have that rod rebuilt, but that's a project for another day. But anyways, we got our safety stops out on both sides, and we got the boom raised up. I already pulled the cotter pin out here, and now I just got to hammer that pin out of there. Once I do that, then I'll be able to drop the cylinder down. When we do cylinders like this on the lift cylinder or tilt cylinder, you can actually leave the cylinder on the machine in a lot of cases. And so that's what I'm going to try and do here. I'm going to leave it, pinned at the bottom, and I'm going to take the pin out at the top and just kind of hang that cylinder down and leave it attached at the bottom. That way I still have that rigidity at the bottom, so I can get on it and torque on it to get that cap off. So we'll get that pin pounded out of there up top, and then we'll see what we can do with the rest of it. All right, so luckily that pin came out nice and easy. Didn't have to heat it or anything, it just pounded right out. So now what we'll do is we'll pull that stop in on this side, and we'll lay the cylinder down on the fender, and then we'll let the loader come down until it rests on that stop. I had to raise it up higher than the top of the wraps because I had to pound the pin, from the back side or from this side, and I couldn't get in between the lift arm and the top of the wraps to do it where it was at previously. And so that's why we had to go up higher. When we're putting it back in, we can pound it in from the outside, so that won't be a problem. All right, now I've got that cylinder down here where I can work with it better. As you can see, I got a block in here so that it's holding the cylinder up so it's not putting pressure on the steel lines or anything like that when I go to take this gland nut off. This is going to make a big mess, I'm sure, because that cylinder is full of hydraulic oil. But that's just the way that this kind of work goes. I see I've got some hoses here that definitely need to be replaced, but for the amount of hours that I put on this thing in a year, I'm just going to keep monitoring them, and when they start to leak, then we'll replace them, although they are just short little hoses that just go from there to there, so they wouldn't be overly expensive hoses to replace, but a guy's got to save some money somewhere, so until they start leaking, we'll probably just leave them. But we'll work on getting this gland nut off now. This is where I ran into the problem with the tilt cylinder. This gland nut spins off the end of the barrel here, and that one was stuck pretty hard. And so I was using my air hammer to try and thread it off, and I slipped and I hit the rod, and that really did some damage to the rod that's caused that seal to continue to leak. So we're going to be a little bit more careful with this one. Hopefully that doesn't happen, and we'll see if we can't get this thing pulled apart. Yeah, all right, I did end up using my air hammer to bust it loose, which I just hate doing because it's just so much harder on stuff. But got it busted loose, so now we're just taking it off with a hammer and a punch just to get it the rest of the way off. It's more calculated and less damaging. And then I got a drain pan here to try and catch the oil as it comes apart. So we'll get that nut the rest of the way off of there and get that cylinder tore apart. This probably isn't going to show up on the camera very well, but once you get the nut off of there, then you can pound this gland back in. My flashlight battery's dying. Oh, nice. You can pound this gland back in, and then there's a wire clip in here, like a snap ring almost, but it's a round wire clip. That's got to get pried out of there, and then this whole gland will pull out of there. And once that's out of there, the rest of the rod comes with it. So here we've got it most of the way out. I did have to put a bar in here and hammer on it to get it to come out, but that's not uncommon. You never want to put air or anything to them like that to try and force that out, because it'll shoot across the shop, probably go through the wall. So don't do that. Because this was a lift cylinder, I was able to put the foot pedal in the float position, and that allowed the oil to flow back to where it needed to. If it was a tilt cylinder, or if you don't have a float position, you would likely have to unhook your lines from the cylinder. Otherwise, you're trying to compress fluid that has nowhere to go, and so it probably wouldn't be very happy about that. But we'll knock this the rest of the way out of here next. Now you can see your two different parts of the cylinder assembly. You've got the gland on this end, and you've got the piston on this end. Now it's important to make sure that when you're redoing these that you tear them all the way down and replace all of the seals. If you take this nut off here and take the piston off, there's actually an O-ring inside of that piston that seals up against the rod so that you don't get any oil that leaks past there as well. So you got wear bands, you've got your piston seal, you've got that O-ring in there, and then you've got an O-ring with a backup, and then you have for sure a dust seal here, and if I remember right, there's another seal inside of the gland. In fact, I'm pretty positive there is, and that's the one that's most likely leaking, because the dust seal on the end where you usually see the oil leaking out of, that's not the one that is supposed to keep that oil in. That's the one that it's, they call it a wiper seal. That's supposed to keep dirt and debris from getting inside the cylinder. That's not supposed to keep oil inside the cylinder. So you see it leak out of there, but that's not usually the culprit. So we'll get to taking this apart now. What I like to do is I like to do them one piece at a time. So I'll take the piston off the end here, replace all the seals on that, and then set it off to the side. And then I will slide the gland off of here, replace all the seals in that, and then slide it back on the rod. The rod looks good. It's got its usual wear to it, but I don't see any big gouges or anything. And same thing with the piston. I don't see any major issues there. It's scored up a little bit, but for the age of the machine, I can't say that I'm really surprised. And the barrel of the cylinder looks, I would say, pretty normal too. As you can see, my drain pan caught all of the oil. So this may finally be one of those repairs where I don't have a big mess on the floor when I'm done. But I'll start getting these apart, and then we'll replace some seals. So here I've got this wear band off. That part's easy. This is just plastic. All this really does is it kind of helps locate the piston within the bore of the cylinder, and it just kind of takes the brunt of the tolerance, basically, just to kind of keep everything straight. Now, the next part is a little bit trickier. This is a Teflon ring. And it most likely has an O-ring or something like that underneath it. But when you go to put the new one on, you kind of got to stretch it around the piston. And then when you stretch it, it'll stay stretched out. So what you end up doing is you end up putting the new one on. And then you take, I've done like electrical tape, wrapped it with electrical tape, or you can just put a shop towel around it. And then you find a hose clamp. Tighten that hose clamp around it, and that'll squeeze that Teflon seal back into shape. You want to make sure it's not sticking out too far past these, past the groove. Otherwise, when you try to ram it back in, it'll just shave the edge of that off, and you don't want that. I had that happen in the PTO clutch on Dad's 1086, and I took the PTO back out of that tractor, I don't know how many times before we finally figured out that was kind of what the issue was, except in that case, it was war, so the edges of the groove were mushroomed, and when we put that Teflon ring in, it had the opposite effect. It couldn't expand because it was stuck under those mushrooms, and it actually wouldn't expand far enough to seal. So these can be a little bit tricky, especially the first time you deal with them. But and then here you can see the O-ring that was underneath that piston. So we'll go ahead and get to work on that stuff, and I'll show you what it looks like when I've got that new Teflon ring in there, and I've got that hose clamp on there to get it back to where it needs to go. So now that that new Teflon seal is on there, you can tell it's stretched out kind of all the way around. You kind of got to work it in your hands and stretch it. You don't want to tear it in half, but you kind of got to take it and stretch it with two hands, and you don't want to stretch it any more than you have to, because then it's got to be compressed that much more. But you can kind of walk it over the edge. They're frustrating, but once you get this far, the battle's mostly over. So now we'll get some electrical tape on that just to keep it from getting damaged by the hose clamp, and then we'll put a hose clamp on it. All right, so this is the seal that was inside the gland. I'll tell you right now, this is the worst one of the lot to get done. The old one, you can do whatever you got to do to get it out. The new one, not the case. As you can see, it's down in there quite a ways. They're very stiff seals, and they're very difficult to get in there. I believe they make some special tools and stuff like that, but I don't have any of them, and I don't do enough of it to justify it. So what I did was I ended up shoving it up from the bottom and getting it started. And then I actually found a socket that fit this hole just perfectly. And with the drive end up, I was able to help push that up a little bit. Then I would kind of take and tuck it in the groove. And then I'd go back and push it up a little bit and tuck it in the groove, and eventually it popped into place. It's not fun. This one went better than a lot of them have for me, but one thing I would point out there is make sure that you put the new one in the same way the old one came out. On this one, the open lip was to the bottom, would have been to the piston end when it's all put together. That is extremely important, because like this right here, what that actually does is when it's got oil pushing on the backside of it, it causes that seal to flare out tighter against the rod, and that's what actually causes that seal to seal. So if you put that in backwards, good luck, it ain't gonna seal. Same thing on the outside of this. In this large groove here on this one, there's an O-ring and a backup ring, and it's important that you get those on in the right spot. If you put the backup ring on the backside of the O-ring, it ain't gonna work right. So we gotta put them on quick. We'll put a new dust seal in the end here. These are obviously needed to be replaced. All the seals on the inside were hard as a rock and brittle and breaking apart. So that'll definitely help out. And then you can see here, we got the hose clamp on that Teflon ring. I got a couple of wraps of electrical tape on it first to protect it. So while we've been doing all the stuff with the gland, we've had the piston in preparation there. So we are just about ready to start putting all this back together. All right, we're fully reassembled, and we're just gonna go ahead and slam it back in the cylinder. We'll get everything hooked back up, and that should be the end of this project. If you guys have any questions, please leave a comment. Obviously, this is not the same for every hydraulic cylinder. This is just specific to this cylinder, but a lot of the internal components are the same. So the biggest thing that I would say is take your time and make sure that if you've got directional components, that you're putting them on the same way you took the old ones out, assuming the guy that rebuilt it before you knew what he was doing, or the guy that built it at the factory. But it should be leaking worse by now if that was the case. But yeah, then you shouldn't have any extra parts left over when you're done, and I don't, unless you've got a universal seal kit or a seal kit that fits more than one application. Then you could have some spares. But we'll go ahead and slam her back together. We should be good to go.